Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. And I'm your host, Isaac Levin. If you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you're watching or listening. Also, if you're interested or know anybody who might be interested in coming on chatting, feel free to reach out to me on Twitter. You can find me there at Isaac R. Levin. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get started. I got my coffee ready, and I'm excited for my guest today. My guest today is Ram. Ram, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself?
Hey, Isaac. Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And thank you, Isaac, for having me on the show. I'm currently a developer advocate at the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Well, no points for guessing, but today's conversation is probably going to be dominated a lot
Sure.
by the work that's going on at Cloud Foundry and within its community.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to talk a little bit about Cloud Foundry and all the sort of really interesting things that you folks are doing over there. I'd like to get started though, talking a little bit about your kind of origin story in tech. So,
Mhm.
do you remember a particular time in your life when you came across tech for the first time and you kind of realized that tech was what you want to be interested in and what you wanted to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, computers obviously represented these magical things in the household
Sure.
back when I was young, and that was really the starting point. Even like pre-internet, DOS was just amazing to have at home, and tinkering all of these things and um, making use of multimedia. It was a word back then, right? Um, so making use of all of that for like learning, and it was just very exciting having a computer at home and just being able to interact with it and make use of it for pretty much everything was
Sure.
was amazing. But um, in terms of my specific role and what I do day to day, I have been like an engineer by training. So I have degrees in engineering, software engineering, and telecom systems and stuff like that. But along the way, I took a break from being an engineer and wanted to teach for a while. So I taught computer science for university freshman year and like sophomore year and things like that. And um, developer advocacy and being in like devrel sort of marries this passion for technology very well with my ambitions for being an
Sure.
educator and being able to teach and stuff like that. And so um, along the way of being a software developer and then a product manager and things like that, I found devrel, and that was a really key moment in my career. And I probably don't want to switch to anything else
Sure.
right now. And so being able to discover this as a career where you get to teach folks about technology and you get paid rather well for it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
is I think a great combination, a winning combination for me, and that's like my big moment um, career wise.
No, I mean, I jokingly say like the opportunity to do the things you love or the things you have a ton of interest in and get paid for it is kind of like the dream, right? Um,
Yep.
yeah, so I kind of would like to go kind of quickly through, obviously, I think, being introduced to computers at a fairly early age, it was kind of really impactful on you. Like, when did you actually
Mhm.
start to get like your hands dirty, like building things? Were you more on the hardware side, where you were kind of working in that space, or did you write a lot of apps, build websites? Like, which path did you take when you started to work in technology?
Well, I've had the good fortune of being a generalist. In college, I got started with like very low level computing, doing assembly language and things like that, working with microprocessors and controllers and what have you. And eventually, by the time I graduated, I got the opportunity to do like some socket programming and things like that, which was slightly higher. And then around that time, Android became like a thing, and then iOS apps and mobile app development also started to boom. And so I had the fortune to work on like the earliest Android devices, like the G1 and things like that. And so
Sure.
that happened too. So um, it's I again, I just had the chance to work on like a lot of different pieces of the technology spectrum. So you know, doing cloud stuff, doing mobile stuff,
Yeah.
doing low level stuff. So um, it's very convenient when you meet like people from like different areas and want to chat about different things, and you kind of uh, are never lost in the in the woods.
Sure.
And like IoT is making like a big comeback in terms of putting hardware and electronics at the front and center of the tech conversation. And so it's great to be able to pick up things and tinker with a few things. And um, after a while I sort of lost touch with that world and then moved to like the cloud and Kubernetes and containers. And now Kubernetes are on the edge, and so now you sort
Yeah.
of can go back to like building like a rack of Raspberry Pis and putting like Kubernetes clusters on
Yeah.
them. And the these points of like concurrence are it's very convenient having the experience that I've had and being able to sort of bring all of it together.
No, I mean that's pretty spot on, and I think that there's a ton of interesting things to talk about, like especially when you start to add, like you said, all of these other computing devices, right? Like Raspberry Pi is kind of like an entry level, but Arduino, or even like if you want to build apps that run on TVs or phones
Yeah,
or all sorts of other strange devices, right? Like you kind of need to have this visibility into how to build those sort of apps. And there's frameworks that are coming out now that make it a bit easier, but it's still a learning curve, right?
there is. There's no denying that. I mean, specialization is always good. I guess at some point you just have to um, pick your rabbit hole.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things that'd be really interesting to me too, is a kind of a part of your career progression or your journey, is when did you first encounter or come across open source? Like you mentioned that you had started working like in the Android space. Like, was it then, or what, or did you get introduced to open source a bit earlier than that?
I mean, I've always heard about Linux from like a few people and some open source enthusiasts. And then obviously, Android was a big open source project that I worked with, but I was still consuming all of these back in the day. There's an ECM platform that I started to customize at my first real job. And so this was for one of the big education companies, and they wanted like a content management system. And
Sure.
so one of the systems that we picked was an open source one, and then we had to modify, like our team collectively was modifying a lot of the storage, a lot of ways in which it was serving through our serving information through our gateway and things like that. And that was really my first experience of oh, so this is kind of the value that open source has. This is how upstream contributions can totally change the nature of the software that we originally had and things like that. And so um, yeah, that was my big revelation in terms of how open source actually impacts enterprise and commercial software.
Yeah, I mean that's very interesting because I think at the end of the day, so many businesses are dependent on open source now, right? And I think one of the things that's really interesting, and I'd love to kind of start the conversation there, is about you know it's really advantageous for a company to just use open source, right? But
Hmm.
at the end of the day, if you're not recontributing or kind of giving back to that open source community, you risk um, an opportunity to not contribute in a really healthy way back to the developer community in general. That's where great thing like foundations come in, like Cloud Foundry, to be able to kind
Mhm.
of build that relationship between the developer community and the company. I'd love to hear a little bit about Cloud Foundry and what how you see the interaction between the developer community and the projects that are a part of your foundation.
Sure. I'd also like to address one thing that you started with, though. So there's a lot
Yeah,
of
of course.
companies and tools out there that um, advertise like an open source version, and sorry to go off on a tangent, but um, uh, there's a whole notion that exists out there of open source for marketing, or
Mm-hmm.
open source as a marketing channel whenever you're building developer tools. So, but then on the other hand, there's also like true open source projects that thrive because of the community that they
Yeah.
serve. And so I think as consumers of open source, one of the responsible ways of doing it is, like you mentioned, go back and make an effort to contribute it.
Mm-hmm.
And contribute not just by being a member, writing a check, and forgetting that these people exist until the renewal cycle.
Sure.
So it's about keeping an active dialogue, contributing some fraction of engineering time, or again, contributions don't have to be technical in nature. There's probably like a ton of documentation work that the project can benefit from. There's probably a few landing pages that folks can contribute to. There's probably very good events that are local, that are hard for open source projects to reach and participate in and find a voice in. So contributions can come both from technical as well as non-technical
Yeah.
areas. And for folks that are listening, if there is an opportunity that you have, in which you can contribute to these, please do so. And again, I'm not just talking about the open source as a marketing tool kind of
Yeah.
companies. That's just pure open source tools and projects that are out there that definitely need help.
No, I totally agree. I think one of our responsibilities in tech is to make sure that like good work that's built by hobbyist developers or people that are kind of building things in their non-work time, like making sure that those sort of things don't disappear, because I think that it really empowers the rest of the technical community to be effective. Um, yeah, I think like I would love to kind of hear, the story of Cloud Foundry, like how it came to be and how you joined the team.
Sure. So the project has some origins with Borg. So Borg, I guess figures in like about 50 different stories
Sure.
right now. But um, so the team that started this was at Pivotal, uh, and one of the goals that they started off with was um, to provide like a pass substrate that just works. And the whole world was sort of, I guess not the whole world, the whole technical world was looking at Heroku just the way people look at Harry Potter, right? So
Sure.
it just felt like magic. And to be able to mimic that experience, I think, was one of like the very early goals that Cloud Foundry had. And so and they were very successful at doing this with one of their projects called Bosch. And so Bosch was intended, or Bosch was named as like the next generation of Borg. So they just took R and G and switched to the next letters, and they arrived at BOSH from
Mm,
BORG. So back in the day, it was a lot of Ruby. It was a lot of working with different languages and frameworks and making that same single command and single click deployment experience a reality
sure.
on private clouds, or on you know um, on-prem installations of your own cloud provider and things like that. And then eventually the popularity of Bosch sort of took off, and that spawned a whole ecosystem of cloud foundry based services, and then cloud foundry based developer experience, um, best practices and things like that. And so it took the shape of a commercial vendor or a commercial company known
Yeah.
as Pivotal, and Pivotal um, started to grow like a tea. So on the one hand, you had folks that were deep into engineering and doing R&D in order to build software products,
Sure.
and then on the other hand, you had an arm that offered services, so software development services built on top of all of these technologies that they were um, developing and releasing. And so a lot of interesting projects emerged from the stable of Pivotal. So some of it is Pivotal issue tracker, that was like relatively minor but still good. There's Concourse CI, which is I guess considered the most opinionated CI/CD system in the world,
Sure.
but it has like a cult sort of following uh, based on what it can do. And so very highly functional, very robust, very resilient. And I guess the most popular thing to emerge from the whole effort was the CF push experience, or what we define as the CF push experience, which is again, just to draw a parallel, it was like the Heroku push, Git push master kind of experience. So you just point your code. Um, Cloud Foundry had the ability to take your code, convert it into an executable, and put it on a VM somewhere that can run. So along this journey, VMware saw a lot of interest in what they could do with a tool like this. And in 2015, around 2015, so VMware decided to acquire Pivotal. And
Sure.
then, because they saw a lot of value in other organizations also being able to use this and do some upstream contributions, they decided to open source Bosch and the entire ecosystem of services around it. So Concourse and Pivotal Issue Tracker and RabbitMQ, I think that was one of their
Sure.
big projects as well. So all of these were governed by an independent foundation known as the Cloud Foundry Foundation,
Mm-hmm.
and its members were VMware and IBM and SUSE and SAP, and a whole host of like
Sure.
service providers and system integrators as well. Um, so 5 years after this happened, uh, so there was some leadership changes that happened along these, which I'm going to skip. But I guess the big change that came along was Cloud Foundry decided, I guess, all of the people, the stakeholders, the board, and the CFF leadership decided to accept an offer to make it a directed fund within the Linux Foundation.
Okay.
So it was operating completely independently at one point, but around 2020, this transition happened where Cloud Foundry became subsumed into the Linux Foundation. Um, so basically, administratively, it meant that the CFF is a part of the Linux Foundation, but as someone who's been through the transition, a lot of our operations are quite independent, and
Sure.
the LF provides like a ton of support whenever required. And yet they just allow CFF to operate independently, and there's a very smooth transition in terms of um, who owns what, and the community is left largely undisturbed to all of these changes that have happened. So yeah, right now it's the it's past a year that we've transitioned to be a part of the LF. We've obviously had a lot of advantages, because we are now very adjacent to the CNCF. We're very adjacent to the CD Foundation. We are adjacent to a lot of these other foundations who we take advantage of and who we can work with, and there's like a huge overlap between the work that a lot of these different foundations do that we can make use of, and um, give better opportunities to our community and to our
Sure.
contributors. So yeah, that's the CF story of
Yeah.
about 10 years or so.
That's great. Thank you so for all that backstory. I think one of the things that I would love to, to get a little bit more of insight into as well is, you know, what is the overall mission of the Cloud Foundry Foundation? Is it to kind of enable that more seamless interaction and building out of Kubernetes or cloud native applications? Is there other aspects as well? Like, I would love to kind of get your thoughts as to like what problem the foundation can help solve.
So I think the foundation itself is concerned with matters around governance and the contributor experience. So we want that to be at the forefront of what we do. Now, obviously, we're fully committed to Cloud Foundry in its present form. It's mostly consumed as what we like to call CF for VMs, but is also it goes by other names like Bosch, I guess. So we we're fully committed to preserving that project, and consequently I think what we are signing up for is app developers should have the convenience of seeing their apps deployed without having to get into a quagmire of tangential tasks like
Sure.
go write a Terraform script or go write a Docker file or go wrangle this YAML and figure out how to get your app on a cluster somewhere. So not that I have anything against all of these
Sure.
wonderful technologies, but uh, it's just that app developers probably are more efficient when they're writing apps. So consequently, it's also about giving platform operators the opportunity to fine tune all of these deployments independent of what developers are doing.
Yeah.
So um, again, the intent is not to keep these two disciplines siloed and not speaking to each other or not having to interface, but it is also about if you want to up the efficiency and achieve a lot more productivity as an enterprise organization, Cloud Foundry has to provide that ability for you. And if you're much smaller and if you have like a bunch of different folks who are doing the same set of tasks, it should give the opportunity for your limited amount of resources to be put into use where it can be most effective. So ops work should fine tune ops work, and dev work should be undisturbed by any ops burden. So I think the Cloud Foundry paradigm sort of helps preserve this for teams of all sizes, and um, generally can impact like a large set of software developers, no matter what vertical they are in. So I think the mission of the foundation is to continue to enable this, and being able to achieve this on, let's say, Kubernetes based infrastructure is
Yeah.
one of the many projects. So, irrespective of what the infrastructure that folks are using, irrespective of what languages or frameworks that they choose to develop in, I think the developer experience and the operator experience and preserving that, I think, is at the center of what the foundation would like to see.
Yeah, I mean that's it's really really interesting. I think you mentioned a couple of things as somebody who thinks they're a developer. I think one of the things that's very very interesting, like you make a very very solid point about we're starting to see more and more drift for infrastructure or ops management into the typical developer workflow, and I
Yep.
think some tools enable the rapid building of environments and things like that, like you mentioned Terraform and obviously things like Kubernetes to kind of orchestrate all these things. But it kind of like you made a point about like these aren't supposed to be developer tasks typically,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's one of the things that's very very interesting. And now I see kind of this pivot. I've seen it in the last year or so. Is okay, so now all these tools exist that kind of like enable like this DevOps end-to-end experience that developers can take advantage of. But now developers are like, this is too complicated. There's too much stuff here now. So
Right.
we need tools now to help like obfuscate or hide away some of these other tasks that we want to be focused on building apps, not on, like you said, all these other things. Like I would love to kind of get your thoughts as is someone who's is working and kind of trying to ease that developer burden. Like, you know, is it too much to ask a developer to manage infrastructure and all the things that go along with that in a cloud native world, or is it just something that focusing on the app should be the core responsibility?
It's definitely a very nuanced topic.
Yep.
On the one hand, I gravitate towards, yes, a developer must be made aware and should be able to manage everything from the application all the way down to the infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
but not at the same time. Not at a point where it becomes too much of toil, and not at a point where when they're trying to get an app deployed and running, they shouldn't be worried about configuring the elk stack, let's say.
Sure.
Right. So I think it's important to be able to give developers, the ability to focus on one thing at a time.
Yeah.
And that's really where I sort of see the narrative missing, right? So yes, you want to be dev, sec, biz, fin, ops, whatever it is, whatever you can
Sure.
cram
Sure.
between dev and ops, you can be all of these different things, but not at the same time, right? So
Yes.
you want to give people the ability to focus on dev work when they want to do dev work, and you give people the ability to do ops work if and when they feel like it, if
Yeah.
bandwidth is available, if there's interest, if the skill set. I mean, not every developer is good at imagining things way down the stack, and so you don't want to necessarily burden them with all of this without reading the context, or without checking for um, what their priorities are and things
Yeah.
like that. So um, yeah, I think that's the nuance that like a lot of folks are missing, and things can get a little overwhelming. And how many hands and eyes and heads does should a developer have, right? So that becomes very tricky to answer. And so um, there should definitely be tools that ease each of these different areas. So if you want, for let's say, I mean, couple of years ago, before joining the foundation, I was working with a company that did monitoring tools,
Mm-hmm.
and so uh, you know I was introduced to a lot of the DevOps paradigms around that time, and I was discovering, like you just mentioned, the sheer number of things that a
Yeah.
developer is starting to become responsible for. And so a lot of the thought process that went into the product was about, okay, how do we make a developer aware without overwhelming them, or
Yes.
without just alert them for every time something happened, and so they start to ignore things, and it becomes a boy cried wolf kind of story. And people will start to miss things, and there's just fatigue, and nobody has any interest anymore. So I think everything that developers are responsible for, every tool is starting to realize that in a sort of maturity model, a ladder sort of situation, where at the beginning they're all like, oh yes, every developer has to use this, but then they start to slowly discover how much of noise that they're creating. And if they're able to refine that and provide like a more isolated experience where developers who are willing to go down that route can, if they want to, and if they don't, they can just stay awake and continue to consume the tool though. And products that are being very good at this are the ones that are seeing the most success.
Yes.
That's really what I feel.
I mean, I totally agree. I think that there is something to say too about people tend to gravitate towards tools that make their lives easier, right?
Hmm.
Like, and I
Yeah.
think especially like when new complexities enter the world, like now I have to be able to run applications on the edge across
Yeah.
different time zones and different geographies, and they all need to be 100% auto scalable and all these other things, right? Like you need solutions that can make that easier. Because I think
Yep.
building, you know, one by one, if each company was to build their version of Kubernetes or their version
Yeah.
of load balancing or whatever, right? Like it becomes challenging, and I think
Yep.
obviously some teams can't take on that work. Um, so I mean, one of the things that's really interesting too, especially about this cloud native space, is that it is very open source driven. And I don't know if that's
Yep.
because of the primary technologies that exist in this space or open source first tools like Docker and Kubernetes. Like I would love to kind of get your thought is like what part does open source come to play when we start talking about these cloud native applications or cloud first type of applications?
I think the cloud native ecosystem has open source as one of its sort of founding core principles. Um, and I don't know. This is a bit of a causality dilemma for me because I don't remember if they wanted to be open source first or cloud native
Sure.
first. But right
Sure.
now, it's all happening together, and it's a good thing. So I'm not going to dig into it.
Yeah.
But um, I think there's a lot of value that these companies are adding because those who build on top of these and really aim to provide value to a larger consumer base or become more consumable of sorts, I think companies are able to uh, build on top of these much easier than if they were working with singular proprietary vendors, wherever. Um, also, I think one of the big changes that are happening is the whole globalization within this ecosystem. So if
Sure.
you look at the CNCF like chart that is huge and dense and unreadable, there's open source projects on there from a lot of different countries. And so um, I think the open source push has really changed the way that different companies and different products and different tools are competing with each other. So people are not rushing to New York to build an office. People are not rushing to
Yeah.
Singapore to set up an office. And um, it's I think open source has played a very key role in enabling that kind of transformation. You can be, I don't know, two people and a cat working from Finland, and
Sure.
yet you
Yeah.
can, have a huge impact in the way your tool or your product gets used and modified, and upstream contributions come in, and you could be, in the financial capital of the world, bang in downtown Manhattan, and you can still have like the same impact. And so I think open source has had a huge role to play in that.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love your analogy of like two people and a cat, right? The only issue with the two people and a cat is that, when big companies start to use the technology that's built by two people and a cat, scale becomes a problem, right? And that's I think why it's important, like we were talking about earlier, for some larger companies to kind of do their part in the open source space, which I think happens a ton. I think one thing that's also really interesting, especially about Cloud Foundry, is that the goal, like Cloud Foundry, like they support and promote projects that is that are interesting to the space they're looking to bring value to, right? Like, what are
Mhm.
some of the projects that you think, folks should be aware of?
So historically, there were efforts to put Cloud Foundry on Kubernetes, and so there were projects called Fizzle, which I guess is no longer. Uh, I don't know how to put this. It's no longer very public. It's sort of consumed in other forms. So then the next generation of that was evolved into what I
Sure.
think is called Quarks, and then Irene. And Irene is available right now, very relevant, very important in bridging like the CF and Kubernetes gap. Um, and then there's like a project that we're going to release this month, called Corifi, which builds on the efforts that all of these efforts or all of these different projects culminated in, which is to be able to provide a CF experience over Kubernetes and to do it in the most kube native or kube
Sure.
idiomatic way as possible. That said, I guess CF for VMs continues to be very relevant too. There's like a bunch of different projects in terms of the app runtime, and some of the foundational infrastructure that are undergoing very interesting changes. And um, but I guess my personal favorite project in the whole CF ecosystem is Paketo build packs. So I'm just going to go off on a bit of tangent
No,
and do
no,
like.
no. I love it. I love it.
So BuildPacks is a CNCF project. So buildpacks.io is their website. So they promote a means to containerize applications without having the need for like Docker files and YAML and all of these other things. And Buildpacks has a history. So they pioneered at Heroku, and then they split into two versions called the Heroku Buildpacks and the Cloud Foundry Buildpacks
Sure.
in order to be able to serve like individual needs of these two communities. And then learnings from all of these over 4 or 5 years culminated into a spec known as the Cloud Native Build Pack. And so an implementation of the Cloud Native Build Pack is Paketo, which is owned by the Cloud Foundry Foundation. Um, so I like the project because there was a fork in the road. People went off, did their own thing, and then they decided to come back together, work on it, and open source it. So Heroku uh, continues to be like a big contributor to the BuildPacks project. So is like like a bunch of engineers from VMware, and um, there's like I know there's a huge um, utility for these build packs in different platforms. So like the Google Pass called KF makes use of this. DigitalOcean's app platform makes use of these build packs. And so it's in itself, it's like a beautiful story in terms of how two commercial vendors decided to take two different paths, but then they came together years later and decided to work on a common spec and open source things. And people are across the technology spectrum are now finding utility for it and making use of this. And so it represents to me a, a great technical achievement in terms of the software that they've built, and also like just the story is an amazing one.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's great. Like build packs, like I don't know, have a ton of visibility into them, but I was looking into them a little bit a couple of weeks ago, just because I had a question about doing a particular thing and it just happened to come up on a search, right? So I think like the
Mm,
ability to like, package up pieces of functionality and just have them run is really, really interesting, especially for folks like we've talked about that are just trying to get a job done, right?
right.
And I think that's really, really
I think
cool.
that goes back. Oh, sorry. I think that goes back to the original Cloud Foundry vision, which is, I think somebody captured Onsi. I think is the back in the day he was like a pivotal executive or something, but he said, "Here's my source code, run it on the cloud for me. I don't care how." And so that,
Sure.
in a sense, captures a lot of what we've been talking about, but also uh, that was a reality because of the build packs project and what had happened. So yeah, I think they're very build packs are very key to enabling this experience of um, the the transformation from source code to containers running
Yep.
on the cloud, and being cloud native and things like that.
Yeah, no, I mean that's great. What other, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts too, like out of the outside the ecosystem of Cloud Foundry, like what are some other um, open source technologies or cloud native sort of technologies or frameworks that you're paying attention to these days?
Knative is one. So Knative represents, I think, what I personally believe is like a new, or quote unquote next gen, in terms of being able to scale loads on the cloud and being able
Sure.
to manage infrastructure in the most efficient way possible. So that's one project. There's also a few um, things like few classics, right? So Prometheus is a classic.
Sure. Sure.
uh, I don't know what the world would do without them. Grafana is another project that I love, and I consume it a lot. Again, I'm also guilty of not contributing much,
Sure.
but there's the odd thing here and there that I get to tinker with and make use of, and
Yeah.
these are all like very interesting in terms of their utility. And I guess in terms of after starting with Cloud Foundry, people are probably scrambling for Prometheus and Grafana and installing them and making use of them, right? So work with them a lot and pay a lot of attention to their trajectory generally. Yeah, Fluentd is also a favorite. Istio is a perennial favorite, because of just the sheer complexity of Kubernetes
Sure.
networking. I think it's very important. The work that they're doing is very important, and uh, yeah, those are the ones that I pay attention to the most. And
Yeah. Yeah, you listed a couple of ones that are very interesting because I feel like it seems like a lot of tools that have been created are to kind of make doing this particular task with Kubernetes easier, right? Like you mentioned Istio, and whenever I think of Istio, I'm like, oh yeah, like I don't know if there's very many Kubernetes clusters that don't have the Istio sidecar, right? Like I can't
yeah,
imagine very many, right?
yeah,
Like things like Prometheus, like at the end of the day, like you're gonna need monitoring, right?
yeah,
So you might as well like just use this monitoring.
yeah,
And I mean, there's tons of tools that we haven't talked about that I think are quite interesting as well that kind of slide
definitely.
themselves in there, right? I think one thing that's also interesting too is that like these a lot of these ideas they've kind of turned into the de facto standard, right? Like we did mention
Yeah,
like Istio, de facto standard for what it does,
yep,
right?
yep,
Like so I would love to, if you're building something like Istio at some point in time, and I imagine that that problem has been solved a few different ways. But like I'm always curious is like how do you build something and then you're like, oh, like that already exists and it's way bigger and has all this adoption, right? So like how do folks get the motivation to continue to build these sort of solve these sort of problems that have quite like at least to the market the industry have already been solved?
I think there's definitely been precedents, right? um, Speaking from a very consumer standpoint, yeah, Ford is not the only car manufacturer. And so, there's always going to be some very niche needs and requirements that some of these more generic tools might not be able to fulfill. And so, um, even, you know, taking Cloud Foundry as an example, as a, uh, you know, platform, it's very opinionated. It wasn't like the first pass in the world that was as popular, but even if you build a tool that is very opinionated and solves a problem in a particular way, there's there's probably going to be enough takers for it. If there aren't, then the you're probably uh, wrong with your core product vision, as opposed to saying, oh, there's nobody that's going to use it. So um, there's always going to be a fraction of developers who like things done a particular way. And so uh, there's definitely going to be um, a general purpose tool for achieving a particular end. And then there's going to be a whole bunch of opinionated tools that achieve the same end but through slightly different means, or they abstract like a bunch of different things, or they improve the developer experience a lot. So I think if people are able to focus on one of these areas, then there's always going to be room for one more tool in the same space.
Yeah,
On the flip side, I think we could make the argument for uh, why doesn't tool B that comes after tool A just become like an upstream contribution to tool A?
sure,
And the answer is, you want certain tools to remain general purpose and generic, catering to a wide variety of use cases, and you want tools that are very specific, that cater to a very singular use case. And maybe people want that tool. Maybe people want something that's optimized for, I don't know, parameter X versus parameter Y.
sure.
So yeah, so I think that's the approach that I would take if I ever was building something in the same space that already exists.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely, I definitely see there's no real opportunity to, like, you can always fill in a gap, like, because there's always going to be gaps
Yeah.
forever,
Yep.
right? Because as new tools come out that are quote unquote de facto standard, like, those tools are always going to have gaps because the responsibility to build like the complete end-to-end solution is just too much to bear for a lot of instances, right? Plus it's just out of
Hmm.
scope of the original goal of the project. I
Right.
think, one of the things I also think is really interesting about something that you said is, like, all of these groups kind of they figure out ways to collaborate, right? Like, hey, how do we provide a great integration mechanism for this particular technology or this particular tool into our system, right? Like, do you think that that's because out of necessity or just because of the open embraciveness of the open source community at large?
I think it's a bit of both. So let's take like an example of something that's very current, right? So there's Istio and there's Linkerd. Some reviews or some opinions put Istio as the de facto standard, and there's like no Kubernetes cluster without an Istio. Whereas
Sure.
some folks say, well, Linkerd is more performant for XYZ use cases, so make use of that as opposed to Istio. And so
Yeah.
I think the notion here, it's definitely the ability to embrace any kind of technology or any innovation or any improvement in like a very specific case for each tool that we're using. And so people want to achieve certain things with their tools, and as long, because this community sees these tools as a means to an end, there's obviously they're going to pick the best one for the job. And so being open source facilitates that hugely. And yeah, so like you mentioned, it's a combination of both of those things, about being able to continue to develop different things and being able to embrace that with openness, and not being um, not having to pick one for the other, and being able to integrate and work with all of these things.
No, I totally agree. I think that that's, you know, I think one of the things that I've seen in technology in the last 5 years is there's just willingness to collaborate, right?
Yep.
I think in
Yep.
the past, you had organizations that really didn't want to collaborate with other organizations because they saw them as competitors. I think now
Yep.
everybody is starting to see, or recently started to see, hey, like we can all work together to solve problems, right? Like I
Correct.
think not to be crass, but there's enough money out there for everybody. Like we don't
Yeah.
need to compete anymore. Like sure we can compete at in particular sectors or segments or whatever, but in the
Yep.
overall scope of technology, like we can partner far more than we can compete, which I think is
Yep.
just great for the overall community. Yeah, as we're starting to wrap up here, like I would love to hear Ram, like what are kind of the next steps? Like what are the things that you're looking out for, to kind of continue the movement or the motions of the foundation?
So I guess much like the rest of the world, the pandemic has affected
Sure.
the foundation too. So emerging out of this very ambiguous and uncertain couple of years is the big thing for us. So we're starting to uh, try and put the focus back on in-person events and seeing where to best spend our limited time and energy and budgets and all of these things. uh, a few years ago there were like a lot of local cloud foundry events that were happening around the world. So like DevOps days happen right now.
Mm-hmm.
Cloud foundry days were a thing back in the day.
Sure.
So although we might not hit uh, you know the same kind of participation and stuff, but I think it's time to start getting the community interested in coming together and collaborating over cloud foundry. um, it's also been very liberating in terms of not having to think about geographical constraints or time zones and things like that. And the pandemic has worked well in bringing the community together in certain ways. But also I think the community sees a lot of intrinsic value in being
Yeah.
able to come together. And so we're also finding ways to reward our contributors somehow, through physical events or through some kind of meetups and things like that. So figuring that out, I think, is like a very important priority at the foundation. And obviously, like I mentioned, there's a couple of projects and releases that we have for this
Yeah.
year, which we're seeing is very important for um, the existing cloud foundry community, obviously, but also like the extended Kubernetes community and anybody who's generally interested in uh, you know technology and cloud native transformations and things like that. So um, the focus at the foundation is on giving like a good marketing push for
Yeah.
some of this amazing technology that the community has come up with.
No, I mean that's great. I love to hear that there's a lot of momentum coming, especially as things starting to open back up, right? Like I think people are
Mhm.
going to be wanting content, wanting to collaborate, which I think is awesome. All
Yep.
right, well, so I think we're at the end of our time, and Ron, I think want to thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me. Do you have like any parting words or last things you'd like to call out?
No, I think first of all, thank you so much for reaching out and wanting to talk about Cloud Foundry.
Yeah,
But also I've since the time we've been introduced, I've been following a few of the other interviews as well, and it's just great to be able to listen to other people share their stories. And I'm able to empathize with some of the problems that the
yeah.
open source folks are all having. But I guess it's amazing that you're able to provide this platform and get more stories told and get more information out there generally. So um, it's um, it's very heartening to see all of that, and I wish you continued success with this series.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, I tell people that I do this solely to have interesting conversation with people that are passionate about technology like me. So I really appreciate your time. One last question that I love to ask my guests as we wrap up is, if you can think of, open source, technology, the community that's built around it, and you only had one word to think of, like what word that be for you?
Inspiring.
Inspiring. That's great.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love it.
Uh,
I mean,
sure.
yeah, no, I think one of the things too that's really really great about the work that you're doing at Cloud Foundry Foundation is you're trying to inspire like the next level of contribution to the cloud native community, which I think is truly inspiring in and of itself. So, um, Ram, I want to thank you again so much for your time for being on the show and for folks tuning in. I definitely enjoyed the conversation and looking forward to our next edition of Coffee and Open Source. Take care,
Yeah.
everybody.
That's it. Bye, everyone.